The CoCo Crew Podcast is hosted by CyberEars. If you are serious about your podcast hosting needs, you should check out CyberEars. Whether you are a podcaster, a radio host, a musician, a narrator, an audiobook author, or simply a school, church, corporation, or anyone else with an audio recording that needs to be hosted or distributed, you should check out cyberears.com. Unlimited bandwidth, fast, reliable, and rugged servers with no hidden fees. CyberEars, your audio, your terms.
Listen, it's getting closer.
Hey, you got your CoCo 3 yet? Hey, you got your CoCo 3 yet?
You're listening to the CoCo Crew Podcast, a delicious adventure into the world of retro computing news and information featuring the Tandy Color Computer. All right, well, welcome back to the third episode of the CoCo Crew. I guess it's really the fourth episode. We started at 0, but this is CoCo Crew episode 3. I am John Linville, and my co-host is Neil Blanchard, and we're still working out our timing a little bit, but I think we're still having a good time. We're here again to talk a bit about the Tandy Color Computer. We were noticing that it is, as we were recording, we are right at 6 months away from the next last Chicago CoCo Fest. That will be April 23rd and 24th, 2016, at the Heron Point Convention Center in Lombard, Illinois. So again, we've got 6 months. We're 6 months out. It's very exciting, kind of invigorating for me. I don't know about Neil, but I'm starting to think about what sort of projects I might be able to do to wow and impress the other CoCo folks, or at least have something to sit and doodle with on the show floor. How about you, Neil?
Yeah, definitely scrambling for another project.
Of course, Neil, I know, is actually headed back that way already. He'll be there very soon, August 29th and 30th for VCF Midwest. Of course, that'll be at a different location now. That's going to be in Elk Grove Village, Illinois. So I've kind of jumped ahead to the announcements, but let me go ahead and walk through some of our standard announcements. This is the CoCo Crew Podcast. We are on Twitter at CoCo Crew Podcast. We are also available through a Facebook page. Look for the CoCo Crew Podcast on Facebook and have a little bit of fun and interactions with folks there while you're waiting for the next episode to arrive. The podcast is available through iTunes, and we're available for streaming on Stitcher. If you want to reach the CoCo Crew for show feedback or suggestions, or to tell us we mispronounced your name, or anything else like that, we have a few email addresses. Set up. You can reach both Neil and I at show@cococrew.org, podcast@cococrew.org, or feedback@cococrew.org. And if for some reason you only want to talk to one or the other of us, I'm available as john@cococrew.org, and Neil is available, of course, as Neil@cococrew.org. You have no excuse. Plus, of course, you can reach us through Facebook, or send us a tweet on Twitter. I'm sure we'll get the message. Just checking today, and it looks like the podcast has reached over 1,000 downloads. Those are individual show downloads, so I don't really know if we've had 1,000 people download episode 0 and give up, or if we have 330 some dedicated listeners who've downloaded every episode. But either way, I'd say we're probably doing okay. I guess we have another little bit of news is we have now going to have some, I guess you'd call it corporate sponsorship. Cyber Ears has kindly offered to host our audio files. And so we are moving the podcast infrastructure such as it is. If you are a iTunes user, I think that will mostly happen without you having to do anything. We are updating the feed through iTunes, and also with Stitcher. Hopefully that will also be fairly painless. If you're directly subscribing to the podcast through the RSS feed at Libsyn, you will need to change over to the new RSS feed. We will make the easiest thing to do to find the new RSS feed is just to go to cococrew.org, and you'll be redirected to the new site at Cyber Ears. All right, let's cover a few news items. Let's see. Our good friend and CoCo aficionado Boise Pete has posted another entry at his Late Night CoCo blog. Why American CoCo 3s are quality challenged. And Boise goes through a description of some of the differences between the Korean CoCo 3s, Korean manufactured CoCo 3s, and the American manufactured CoCo 3s, and details us why the later ones were maybe not as good as the ones manufactured in Korea. The manufacturing of the CoCo 3 moved back to the United States later in its production cycle. By that point, Sandy was definitely trying to squeeze every bit of value out of, or every bit of cost out of the production. And so Freudian slip on the value there.
And the thing that's rare about that is usually stuff made in the USA is better quality.
Well, we tend to think so. Maybe I'm sure there's a few people who would tell us that was not the case in the mid 80s. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but apparently in the case of the CoCo 3s, it was true. So anyway, check out Boise's blog, and he's got some other entries earlier on with some other interesting history. If you haven't seen it, check that out as well. Our good friend Ed Snyder, aka Zipster, has been messing around with the CoCo's little brother, the MC10. If you're familiar with Zipster, he's been doing some composite video adapters they essentially replace the RF modulators in the color computer, and he's essentially done the same thing now for the MC10. I think he's still at a prototype stage there. I don't think he has those available for sale yet. But if you're interested in that, I would bet you that they will become available. And so keep an eye out. Another project in the community that's been around for a while is called the CoCo 3 FPGA. And what this is an implementation of the CoCo 3 architecture in an FPGA evaluation board from Altera. Is that right? Altera?
Yes.
Anyway, the CoCo 3 FPGA is a implementation of the CoCo 3 in an FPGA evaluation board that's been around for a while. It is not a perfect cycle-accurate emulation, but it does some neat stuff, and it can be clocked up to, some versions can be clocked up to 25 megahertz or something. So it's a neat way to have kind of a high-performance version of the CoCo 3. CoCo user Brian Holman, who is someone I met this year at CoCo Fest, has taken it upon himself to write up a nice set of how-to instructions for how to get the CoCo 3 FPGA configuration loaded on the DE1 FPGA evaluation board. This is something that people have had some trouble with. Maybe the documentation isn't as good as it should be in the first place. Anybody who's a developer knows that writing documentation is not as much fun as developing stuff. Brian is a good writer and has done a good job of walking through that configuration and describing how to get that done. And it's a good enough write-up that I'm actually considering getting my own DE1, which I've failed to procure up until this point.
Count me in on that too.
Yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. Do you have a DE1?
No, I haven't got one yet, but after reading this, it definitely makes me want to seek one out.
Yeah, it's a neat project. It's sort of one of the things you hear in the retro computing community is there's always a little debate about emulation versus real hardware. Some people just really like to have a piece of hardware doing their computing. The CoCo 3 FPGA is a nice little bridge between the two worlds. It's a real piece of hardware, and you can actually hook up resistors and wires and whatever to do things with it if you want. But you get some flexibility from it being in an FPGA and potentially add some new features. I think, for example, I think it's got some new graphics modes in it that are not in the normal CoCo 3. So anyway, it's a nice project. That CoCo 3 FPGA, of course, was originated with Gary Becker. He did have an attempt at a Kickstarter project a while back. The price was just, I guess, a little too high for the average CoCo user, so that one did not actually get made. But you can still load it up on a DE1 and play with it and do neat stuff. So if you're interested in the CoCo 3 FPGA, you should check out Brian's write-up and learn more. So someone else who's been in and out of the community over the past few years is Glenn Vandenbigler, who is he's a Canadian, so he's probably cousins with Neil or something. They're all related up there, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, Glenn is one of these fellows you see sometimes in the community who always seems to have a stash of retro stuff from somewhere. And I think his main thing is usually the Amiga. And so he has a website called the Amiga Lounge where he sells Amiga hardware and software. But he also has, in the past he had one called the CoCoLounge.com, and where he's listed for sale a certain amount of CoCo stuff. And a while back he kind of ran out of CoCo stuff and he shut CoCo Lounge down. But then recently he posted that he had gotten another big shipment of CoCo stuff, and he's been listing it for the past few weeks. So the CoCo Lounge is out there and has some neat stuff on it. You may want to check it out. A lot of people sometimes say the prices seem a little high at first. Well, you have to keep in mind that the way Glenn lists his prices, he includes shipping in the price. So you need to factor that in before you evaluate whether or not the prices are good. Also of note, Glenn is already running a little bit low on his CoCo stock, and I suspect when he runs out, the CoCo Lounge may disappear again. So you may want to check it. If you're interested, you may want to check that out quickly and see what's there. And, you may find some neat stuff.
And also to mention, even though he is Canadian, the funds are listed in U.S. currency.
That's correct. He also has he usually has two prices listed. One that has the shipping included for North America, so Canada and United States. I don't know if that includes Mexico or not. And then he has a world price, which is obviously a little bit higher. Anyway, so you may want to check it out. So we have the provocative title of "Is Mocha Dead?" This is from Brad Greyer, who I guess is the author of Mocha. So Mocha is a CoCo emulator that was written in Java. It was originally written a few years back when it was still pretty common for Java to be used to implement applets on a website. And it found some favor with people in the community. But over the years, running Java applets in your web browser is kind of fallen out of favor. And so I guess that's what raised the question, is Mocha dead? Well, so Brad has created a new website that describes how you can still use Mocha and load up your Java-based CoCo emulator either from the command line, or he has some other tricks in there, including I think he has a JavaScript version, which is sort of the new hotness for running applications on the web. I think the JavaScript one is not yet really complete. I did start it up this afternoon, and it looks like it's at least mostly there. We'll see if that ever gets finished out. But, it's always good to have as much access to the CoCo as possible, and I'm sure Neil would agree.
Definitely. That emulator, that's just CoCo 2, right?
I think that is just a CoCo 2, but I'm not 100% sure. Brad, if you're listening, please feel free to send us some feedback and tell us how we have totally misrepresented your project.
I'm pretty sure it's CoCo 1 and 2 compatible, but don't hold me to that.
Well, that's sort of a nice segue into the next item. For quite some time, there's been an emulator available in the community that is ostensibly a CoCo 3 emulator known as VCC, which I guess is Virtual CoCo. VCC is, it's closed source. Those of you who know me in my other life will understand why I have a certain amount of disdain for that. And it's Windows. Again, more disdain. So Windows only. Yet it remains popular with a number of CoCo users. And VCC, unfortunately, has not been updated in some time. So there are a number of sort of nagging problems. For a while, the rumor has been that the original author had intended to open source it, but had never done so. And he kind of disappeared from the community several years ago. But before he did that, he did make the source available privately to a handful of people, including Bill Pierce. And so recently, Bill Pierce has posted to the mailing list and the Facebook group, and I'm not sure where else, that he intends to release the source as an open source project. And he's been taking some feedback on exactly how he should do that and what will happen afterwards. I am, while I'm happy to see VCC becoming available as open source, I do hope that as someone who lives in the open source world and knows how geeks like to play lawyer sometimes, I do hope that Mr. Pierce is consulted proper legal counsel on this just in case, because when you start moving to release things, and we are talking about the law. So hope to see VCC properly released open source, and I hope no one gets in any trouble as a result. And I guess I'll probably just leave it at that. Okay, moving on. Brian Blake has announced that he has added a buy-sell trade forum at his forum site, tandycoco.com. This is in order to provide an outlet for CoCo commerce for anyone who doesn't want to deal with eBay, I guess. It's some people like eBay, some people don't. Some people are always convinced that if we just conducted all our trades somewhere else, the world would be a better place or something. I'm not sure.
We definitely avoid the eBay fees. That's for sure.
Well, that's true. You would avoid the eBay fees. If I was, when I'm selling something, I'd be worried about avoiding the eBay customers. But if that's okay with you, then I hope that will be a welcome news that you have an outlet for selling your CoCo gear. And maybe it is a good way to make sure the CoCo stuff sort of stays in the family if that's important to you. So anyway, check out tandycoco.com's new buy-sell trade forum, and I'm sure Mr. Blake will be happy to have you. In our past episodes, we've mentioned the CMOC compiler that is being developed by Pierre Sarrazin. He seems to be continuing this effort and making progress. And so he has also released recently a what he calls a skeleton for card games. So I think there's code there to help you draw playing cards and such, so you can build a card game. So his example for that he kind of debuted with CMOC was a Crazy Eights game, or Crazy Eights-like game. I think he expressed that he wanted to see somebody write a 52 pickup game for the CoCo, which doesn't sound all that much fun, but maybe there's maybe you could write poker or blackjack or something like that. Playing cards on a computer can be kind of fun. I remember when back in the day, which is back in the day is a banned phrase on many podcasts, but I'm going to use it anyway. Back in the day, I remember playing the blackjack game on my grandparents' in television, which was not a bad game either. And of course, who has not spent some time playing solitaire on their Windows machines, right?
I think my first card game was the Gin on the CoCo.
Oh, yeah? We do have a few card games already. That is true. But, always nice to have a few more, right? So, Pierre, thanks for making that available. And I hope somebody will take up your challenge and produce a fantastic card game written in C or CMOC to the extent that it might be something different. Okay, here's another one that I just happened to see this posted on Facebook. A guy named David Bridget. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it. It kind of looks like Bridget. I don't know if he's an actual CoCo person, as in a retro CoCo kind of person. I don't know if he's on the mailing list or anything, but he posted a picture on Facebook of himself wearing a T-shirt emblazoned with the image of the wizard from Dungeons of Daggerath. Dungeons of Daggerath, of course, was a CoCo-only game. Many people would probably rate it as the best game available on the CoCo. It's an old dungeon crawl style of game from back in the day. There I go again with that phrase. And in fact, Dungeons of Daggerath is such a high-quality game that it plays sort of a key role in the book Ready Player One. Ready Player One, of course, is now on its way to becoming a movie directed by Steven Spielberg. I know I speak for everyone who's ever touched a CoCo when I say, please, Mr. Spielberg, please do not let them replace the CoCo in the movie with an Apple II or an Atari or anything else that might be deemed as somehow more recognizable. It's got to be a CoCo. Please live up to the book.
That would be a shame if they changed the.
That would be downright heartbreaking if they change that to something other than a CoCo. Anyway, so in preparation for that, wouldn't you be the coolest guy in the theater if you showed up to watch the initial screenings of Ready Player One wearing your Dungeons of Daggerath wizard T-shirt? That would be really cool, don't you think?
Definitely.
Also, in a previous podcast, we mentioned how Sockmaster, a.k.a. John Kowalski, had done some work messing around with the internals of Donkey Kong, which originally he had years ago he had done a port of Donkey Kong to the color computer in a very interesting way. He actually did a combination of binary translation of the Z80 instructions over to 6809 instructions, combined with actual emulation code to replace the Donkey Kong hardware with emulation on the CoCo. So it's kind of a weird combination of a port and an emulator for Donkey Kong. And, the best Donkey Kong port to the CoCo and maybe to any other 8-bit machine.
I was just going to say, I think it's the best 8-bit port out there because it plays exactly like the arcade.
It is amazingly good. So anyway, Sock has been messing around with Donkey Kong on the CoCo, fixing a few bugs that sound like mostly the kind of bugs that only the original programmer would ever recognize, but making it better, making it a little faster. And in the process, he's been toying around with changing existing levels and adding some new ones. And he's got a little slew of things, and his intent is actually to port that back to the Donkey Kong hardware with the new levels, and he says he hopes to get the updated Donkey Kong running on original Donkey Kong hardware, hopefully in some of the newer retro arcades that are popping up around the country. So I know I, for one, am cheering on Sock for that. I think it's a great effort. Definitely hope to see it. Anyway, he has the updated version of he had released a few weeks back this updated Donkey Kong code for the CoCo 3, and I guess he's gone through a little bit more and fixed a few more bugs and tweaked some of the difficulties and such, and so he has an updated version of that. So if you're already playing the DK remix from Sockmaster, you may want to update your images and play the latest version. Okay, so for the collectors out there collecting real hardware, a problem that a number of people have had from time to time is that their keyboards mysteriously stop working. This is not just a CoCo, but it's quite a quite common problem in a number of retro computers. And so what it is, on the internals of the keyboards, they actually have little sheets of mylar, which is basically a plastic with conductive traces sort of printed on the plastic. And sometimes those traces kind of flake off or break or otherwise stop conducting electricity. And so it's possible to repair them in many cases. You can use a conductive ink pen, or maybe if you're really clever, you can do some ugly wiring or something to get around them. Well, what is common in a number of other retro computing communities is to just replace the mylars with new ones. And so a CoCo user who's a bit new, it's been around for a couple of years now, I think, is Josh Harper. He's been investigating how to get replacement mylars for the keyboards, and he's found a place that he thinks can do it. Says right now the cost per unit so far is $27.50, which I assume to be US dollars. That's it sounds a little pricey. If you're going to do 1,000 of them, I'm sure that would seem very expensive. If you're trying to save your precious CoCo, $27.50 is a cheap price.
I don't think that's too bad if you want to keep the original going, like keep it restored.
Right. So, like I say, it may be a little bit outside. You're probably not going to pick up 10 of them just to keep around if you don't have problems. But if you do have problems and you want to fix your keyboard, that's a pretty good price. So if you're having that sort of problem, you may want to reach out to Josh. He is definitely on the CoCo mailing list. He might be, I think he's on Facebook as well. I don't really know him personally, but he seems like a nice fellow. So reach out to him, and maybe you get enough people interested, maybe the price will come down a bit as well. Maybe
we could get him to show up at CoCo Fest too.
That would be quite good. Josh, if you're out there, if you're waiting for an invitation, here it is. If you want a written one, send me your address. Okay, so along those same lines, or maybe inspired by that discussion, there's a long thread on the CoCo mailing list about replacing the CoCo keyboards with new mechanical ones. And so people are talking about actually laying out a circuit board with nice mechanical keyboard switches, like from Cherry. A lot of PC gamers or whatever, or sometimes just serious typists, like these mechanical keyboards, and Cherry is definitely probably the premier brand for that kind of keyboard and their key switches. And price that they're talking about, and so this is I guess it's mostly started by Mark J. Blair and Brian Blake, who's been another proponent there, and then several other people have been involved. When you lay out 57 of these keys, and maybe a few more depending on exactly how you want to use them, they're talking about adding function keys or programmability and that sort of thing. The price does add up a bit. So you're talking about some of the estimates are as much as $150 for a keyboard. That's probably beyond my love for a CoCo keyboard, but I can see where some people, I know some people claim to use their CoCos every day and for real world applications. And some people claim to, even if they're doing kind of the same sort of silly things that I do with programming, some people claim to do that programming on the bare metal. If you're one of those guys and you want a nice keyboard to use, this might be a good option for you. So, it's out there. Now, this is one of those times where the CoCo mailing list, sometimes you get a discussion going there and people jump in, and you get a lot of people who maybe don't really know that much about the subject, but feel compelled to jump in on it anyway. So that discussion has run a bit long. I'm not sure where it's going at this point. It seems to have lost a little focus. That doesn't mean that Mark or Brian have lost focus. So those guys might be completing their layouts right now,
sourcing out better prices for the switches.
And these guys, I know Mark. I'm not sure how much hardware Brian has done. I know Mark has done quite a bit. So something could come of this. So if you're interested in that, you may want to reach out to those guys, see what's going on. Again, it could be a good option for your CoCo programming workstation. Barry Nelson has found put together a page that's now on Hackaday on how to hook up your CoCo 3 RGB output to a SCART cable. SCART is a common connector, I guess mostly from the days of analog television, common in Europe, that includes RGB signals as part of the connector. And so with the right set of wiring, you can hook up the CoCo 3 RGB output to SCART. And then I think actually I'm not quite familiar right now. I'm thinking he plugs that SCART into then an existing SCART to HDMI adapter. So if you need to hook up your CoCo 3 to HDMI, you go in through SCART, maybe an easy way to do it. I actually use some SCART cabling for some of my projects for hooking up arcade games and some other stuff. I have a monitor with a SCART port, and I can hook up a number of different monitors to it. So it makes a nice kind of lingua franca for connecting arcade video or other analog video sources to that monitor. Anyway, it's a cool project. If you think you have a need like that, you may want to check it out. I'll have a link in the show notes. We mentioned Zipster earlier when we were talking about his MC10 composite video output. More recently, he has now announced that he has boards available for the 6847 video output. The video display generator has a facility for allowing you to hook up your own character generator ROMs so that you can essentially replace the fonts that are output by the video chip on your CoCo. And so back in the day, in the early days, this was used to provide true lowercase through something called a lower kit. So that was on the CoCo 1s and early CoCo 2s. And you can also put in custom fonts if you just don't like the way the standard VDG font looks. In some systems, it's even used for doing sort of a block or character-based graphics, tile-based graphics, like you'd see, on some game systems. I think Zipster's board is limited to basically to replacement fonts, but if you're interested in having replacement fonts for your CoCo, you may want to reach out to Ed and say, hey, give me a board.
And that's a drop-in replacement for the CoCo 2, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, as I understand it, you should be able to, if your 6847 is already socketed, you should be able to pull it out and plug this board in. Otherwise, you'll need to desolder it and replace it with a socket. But yeah, it's a fairly simple install. It does not require a lot of modifications to the board or anything like that. Okay, moving on. So our friend Simon Jonason, who is past couple of years has been posting various little hacky things that he's done, trying to produce basically demos, graphics demos or whatever for the CoCo, akin to what you'd see in the demo scene for the Commodore 64 or other contemporary machines. He has now turned his attention to the MC10, and so he is getting his 1-bit music player running on the MC10. He's still early days of that, but it produces some pretty respectable audio, certainly a lot better than what you can get from BASIC on the MC10. And it's a neat project. I'm eager to see where he goes with it. I'm not sure the MC10 is going to have the flexibility in the hardware to do all the graphics tricks that Simon has been doing on the CoCo, but he's done a lot of tricks that I didn't really expect to see on the CoCo. So maybe we'll see some cool stuff on the MC10, and certainly we can hear the MC10 play some nice tunes.
Yeah, so far just hearing the audio is impressive.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool project. Speaking of impressive audio, how'd you like that segue? Randy Kindig is somebody who is part of the community. We see him on the list sometimes. He is the host. He's one of the hosts of the Antic podcast, and he is, I think, the sole host of the Floppy Days podcast. And in Floppy Days, he's basically working his way through the history of at least the personal computers and kind of talking about individual machines. He covers a lot of different kinds of machines, but now he's up to 1980, and it's time to cover the Tandy Color computer. And in some of his other adventures, so to speak, he's had to do multiple parts for the episodes for the different machines. And so it sounds like he's going to do several episodes about or at least a couple of episodes about the CoCo. His first CoCo episode is Floppy Days, episode number 44, and he has a substantial interview with our own Boise Pete. Boise, of course, is a historian for the CoCo. He and Bill Judas, of course, combined efforts to produce CoCo, The Colorful History of Tandy's Underdog Computer. It is available through CRC Press, and it is on Amazon.com. If you read the book, I'm sure Boise and Bill would love for you to provide a review for them. It helps them with their book sales.
And I'm not just saying this because I'm into the CoCo, but it's an amazing read, even if you're not into the Tandy Color computer. Just the read in general is amazing.
It is a good read, particularly if you're interested in retro computing history. It's history of old computers before it was retro computing. What it was like producing computers in the early to mid 80s. It's an interesting read. Okay, one final bit of news, which isn't quite news, but or at least it's a bit lacking in details. But Mark Mcdougal is again a name that you'll see on both on the CoCo mailing list and on the Facebook page. Mark has done. He seems to like doing porting projects where he'll take an old game and analyze it very deeply and port it over to other machines. So one of his targets, of course, is the CoCo. Last year, I guess he was working on a port of Lode Runner, which looks to be a fantastic port of that game. I don't know if he's quite finished with that. I know he's interested in producing a cartridge and has not yet done that. So we're still waiting on the final Lode Runner release, but he appears to be working on another new port. He has some blog entries about it, but he has not quite revealed what he is porting. So you may want to check out his blog. That's retroports.blogspot.com. I'll have that link in the show notes as well. So Mark writes some pretty good blog posts on his technical efforts. So if you enjoy reading that sort of thing, you may want to check it out. Okay, I think that wraps up our news for this episode.
Hey there, it's Jason Scott. Hey everybody, I'm here at the first annual gathering of the world followers of the CoCo Crew Podcast. We're actually starting out pretty slow. It looks about 500 people, but we expect another 200 over the weekend. And so I'll just saying hi from the water slide and keep listening to the podcast, and you can come next year.
Okay, let's talk about some listener feedback. Again, we love getting feedback on the show. Loved hearing from our listeners. Otherwise, it's just me and Neil sitting here shooting the breeze. So this show is, it's for us, but it's also for you. So if you're listening and you want to interact with us or tell us where we got something wrong or whatever, we would love to hear from you. Recently on the Facebook group, we did get a piece of feedback from a new listener whose name is Chad Armel. Chad, if I'm mispronouncing your name, please let me know. And this is what Chad writes. Thank you for adding me to the group. As a kid, I owned the CoCo 1, 2, and 3 and sold them all when I got my first PC. I was just thinking of a few Disney games I had that I think my son would like, and it prompted me to search for a podcast last night. Well, to my surprise, I found your podcast. I listened to episode 0 last night while flipping through some archived CoCo magazines. What an awesome ride down memory lane. So, Chad, I'm glad we could stir your nostalgic juices, and hope you enjoyed the podcast. I hope by now you've listened to episodes 1 and 2 and are listening to episode 3. Otherwise, I'm talking to no one. Anyway, definitely good to hear from you, Chad. So also in the realm of feedback, recently in the news, there was or retro computing news. There was a project where some retro computing folks over in the UK put together a very impressive musical performance in response to a programming challenge that had been posed in a programming book back in the 80s. And I have a link to that available on our Facebook page, pretty sure. As in response to that, I posted a question: are there any similar unmet programming challenges that we could find in old CoCo books or magazines? So recently, I got contact from Eric Gavrulik, who is an old CoCo soul, who has been interested lately in stirring up and enlivening the CoCo community. And in response to this, he pointed out to me an article in the August 1983 edition of Hot CoCo that's called Draw and Manipulate Your Own 3D Graphics. And that includes a quote that he sent to me. And so I'll just read that. The second limitation is due to the hardware. The display cannot be made to move faster or to show more complex animation. The 6809 is a wonderful chip, but it can only work so fast. Moving graphic systems more powerful than display, it's capitalized, so that must be the name of the program they're talking about. So moving graphic systems more powerful than display take lots of computing power, more than can be expected of an 8-bit processor unsupported by special graphics hardware. I do not believe this program could be recoded to run more than twice as fast as it does now. Most of the running time is spent in the line drawing routine, which seems fairly efficient to me. So, not quite a explicit challenge, but the gauntlet is sort of thrown down. Anyone out there looking for a programming challenge should be able to find the PDF of that Hot CoCo magazine out there on the web somewhere. If you can't find it, feel free to contact me, and we'll see if we can find it for you. But so there's a programming challenge, and hopefully somebody will answer the call. So I think that probably now concludes the listener feedback section of this episode. After these messages,
we'll be right back.
Bug report. We have found a bug in our show. I guess it's a lot better than finding a bug in your code. Anyways, John and I had mentioned that it's 6 months until the next CoCo Fest, when it is actually 8 months from now. Well, you can't blame us for the error. We just got a little excited about the coolest event. On the plus side, now you have 2 extra months to get your projects ready for the next fest. In case you missed it, the date for CoCo Fest is April 23rd and 24th at Heron Point Convention Center in Lombard, Illinois.
Okay, welcome to part 3 of our series on the architecture of the color computer. Today we're going to talk about the Motorola 6883, or MC6883, also known as the SN74LS783, and we'll talk a little bit about the similar 74LS785, which was present in some of the later CoCos. Anyway, this chip is a central part of the color computer, somewhat uncelebrated, but very important nonetheless. This chip forms what we would probably call, often referred to as glue logic, that sort of turns a bundle of chips into an actual computer system. Specifically designed to work with mating the 6809 or perhaps the 6800 or 6801 or even the 68000 to the 6847 video display generator. So therefore sort of tailor-made for the chipsets involved with the CoCo. The 6883 is also known as the Synchronous Address Multiplexer, or SAM, and so I'll refer to that occasionally as the SAM. The SAM has basically 4 jobs within the color computer. It's in charge of controlling the access to DRAM, which is a bit of a, I don't know if tricky is the right word, but it's a little bit more complicated than you might suspect at the actual component level. The SAM also is responsible for address decoding, So when you actually put an address on the bus, he's the one that tells the correct chip to wake up and respond. The SAM does some memory access arbitration between the CPU and the video display generator, or VDG. And of course, he is actually in control of passing the clock to the CPU. And so therefore he is in control of the overall speed of the system. So that's a fairly simple introduction. I'll try to go into a little bit more detail later. First, I would talk a bit about the history of the SAM. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good information. I did find a little bit of information that suggests that after the Green Thumb project, which we mentioned earlier, just as a recap, the Green Thumb project was a project from the U.S. Department of Agriculture that Motorola brought Tandy in to work on to produce basically an information appliance to distribute to farmers for gathering information related to growing crops. Apparently, in building this system, which was actually built around the 6847 VDG, there was a lot of extra glue logic required to make a system out of the box. Since there was no chip specifically for that, they had to use a number of other discrete chips, simpler chips, and typically 74 series logic, I would imagine. And that takes up a lot of board space. It's very error prone. It generates a lot of heat, that sort of thing. So there was an effort to integrate all those discrete parts and small ICs into a single chip. So they produced this SAM chip, which is a 40-pin DIP, basically the same size as the video display generator and the CPU. The SAM like I said, is designed for building a system out of the chipset. There's actually appendix at the back of the data sheet for the SAM that, if you take a look, it reveals the architecture of a design that is unmistakably that of either the Tandy color computer or the Dragon. So, in a very real sense, it's not at all surprising that when the Dragon came out using the same chipset as the color computer, they ended up with essentially the same architecture, and at least plausibly not as a copy of the CoCo. But in fact, both companies were probably copying straight out of the datasheet from Motorola. Anyway, for a little more information about the SAM, if this podcast is not all the information you need, you might refer back to another article I've mentioned called What's Inside Radio Shack's Color Computer by Mr. Arens, Brown, and Scales, which is available in the March 1981 edition of Byte Magazine, and I'm fairly certain that is available for you to download through archive.org or otherwise whatever other means you have for obtaining old documentation like that. So anyway, that's a quick roundup of the history as much as I know of it. As for usage, again, this is going to be a little bit quick. The machines I know of that used the SAM are the Tandy color computer and the Dragon Data, Dragon 32, Dragon 64, the Tano Dragon, the various clones of those machines. That's all I know. I would love to hear about it if anyone does know of other machines that use the SAM. There probably are some. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe they're industrial single board computers or that sort of thing, but I haven't stumbled across any of them. Love to hear from anyone who knows different.
Hi, I'm Kevin Savitz of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. You're listening to the CoCo Crew. When you're ready to play with a real computer, play with an Atari.
Haha, that's funny. Maybe if it had a 6809 processor in it.
Alright, let's talk a little bit about what the SAM does. As I mentioned, it has those four main jobs of controlling the DRAM access and decoding addresses and arbitrating between the CPU and the video display generator, and of course clocking the CPU. But each of those has a few kind of programmable options. So how do you program the SAM in the first place? Well, it has since he's in charge of decoding the addresses, conveniently he has set aside for himself a address range that lets you set and clear individual bits, and so each bit has a set address and a clear address. So when you access those addresses, it actually doesn't matter what type of operation the CPU thinks it's performing. It's the address itself that determines whether you're setting or clearing a bit. And so then those bits, of course, are gathered into slightly larger entities for determining, grouping stuff to find the actual settings, which cover, there's one bit for the map type that refers to the address decoding. There's a couple of bits that refer to memory size, talking about the types of chips that you're using for your DRAM. There's a couple of bits that refer to the MPU, meaning microprocessor unit, or the CPU, shall we say, the CPU rate. There's a bit to determine which page of DRAM you're accessing when you access the RAM in the memory map. So it's a physical versus logical thing there. There's several bits for determining the offset for display memory, which we'll talk a bit about later, but basically that lets you move around your video window within your physical RAM. And there's a couple of bits that are set aside, 3 bits actually, that are set aside for telling the SAM about what mode you've put the video display generator in. And they don't map exactly one-to-one to the video display generator modes, but they're kind of enough to tell the SAM what he needs to know for interfacing with the VDG. So, like we said, the SAM is responsible for DRAM control. And so what does that really mean? So in a dynamic RAM, dynamic RAM is composed of what are basically capacitive cells, and that's I guess it's an electrical engineering kind of term, but basically they're like little batteries that you charge up with a specific value. It's either a 0 or 1, or a low or a high kind of value. But when you write it to 1, if you just leave it there long enough, eventually it'll all leak out and it'll be 0, even though you meant for it to be 1. So DRAM is built up in a way where they organize all these little charge cups or little tiny batteries in ways where they're organized into groups of rows and columns. And when you access is it a row or is it a column? I always forget. Anyway, when you access, I think it's a row. When you access a row of memory, there's circuitry that will basically read out the bits in that memory and then reset them so that as long as you're accessing memory at a regular pace and a fairly coarse granularity, the memory will keep holding the values that it needs to keep. So part of that involves splitting up the total memory address range so that some of the bits refer to rows and some of the bits refer to columns. So one of the jobs that the SAM performs is this multiplexing of the address lines so that you put out, the CPU puts out a 16-bit address, and SAM divides that up into basically 2 little 7 or 8-bit addresses, one for the rows and one for the columns. The SAM has all the information it needs to do that properly, depending on how you've set it up, and you tell it what kind of chips you're using, which includes 4K or 16K RAM chips, and it knows how the address lines are divided up between those types of chips. You can even use a 64K chip if you want. Then the SAM is then responsible for making sure that whatever your program does, he will also periodically increment those, again, I think it's row addresses that are used for memory refresh, or one way or another. The lines are connected up so that he will control the DRAM refresh so that your dynamic memory contains what you expect it to contain, as long as you've, of course, written your program correctly. So anyway, DRAM control, including refresh, is one of the big jobs that the SAM does. Another job that the SAM takes care of is address decoding, and so basically he looks at the address lines that the CPU passes in, or that the VDG for that matter passes in, but particularly the CPU. He looks at those address lines as they're passed in, and he maps them out based on a couple of maps that are sort of predetermined. They're described in the data sheet. They contain areas that are reserved for RAM, and areas that are reserved for ROM, and areas that are reserved for I/O chips. So to some degree, those are just suggestions. You could hook up a ROM chip where an I/O chip goes if you want, but that's sort of on you. But the point being that when those addresses are accessed, he has some signals that he puts out to the rest of the system that basically says, okay, turn on chip 3 or turn on chip 4. And you can interface a decoder like the 74LS138 for those familiar with 74 series logic. So it'll take those, it's probably 3 pins, I guess, coming off the SAM, and spread them out into a number of individual chip-enabled lines, so that you can then select the specific parts that you want to address for doing I/O or accessing memory and the like. The addressing maps include both ROM access ranges and RAM access ranges, and even has an all RAM map, which will give you basically a 64K RAM image. So altogether, that would give you a 96K amount of mappable memory. But of course, the CPU only can address up to 64K. So you want to be able to swap all these things in and out. One of those options was the memory page mentioned earlier. So depending on the setting of the memory page, when you go to access the memory range in the normal memory map, which would be an address is basically 0 to 32K. If you have 64K of RAM in the system, depending on the way your memory page value is set, you might access the lower 32K of your 64K of RAM, or you might address the upper 32K of your 64K of RAM. And of course, that helps you to be able to switch back and forth. You can load up RAM with an image of what's actually in your ROM before you switch to an all RAM mode. So otherwise, the all RAM mode would be fairly useless, since there'd be no way to load or it'd be at least a lot more difficult to load up the RAM before you could just switch over. That's probably enough about the address decoding for now. I think you probably got the gist of it. The SAM Sam's in control, and he knows how to handle access to various chips, and gives you a couple of options for selecting exactly what's active at a given time. Like I said, there's a couple of bits available for controlling the clock that goes to the CPU. One of those bits basically sets what's called fast mode, so that you get sort of a double clock speed, which typically would be the 1.78 megahertz, no matter what address you're selecting or running from. And that gives you a little speed boost. Unfortunately, when you operate in the faster clocking mode, it turns off the DRAM refresh, and of course it disables the video output, or at least it screws it up. That's not okay. It's okay to turn it on for a little while, but if nothing else, typically just the fact that your RAM won't be refreshed will dissuade you from leaving it on for too long, because your system will crash as it forgets the program that you have running. So perhaps a somewhat more interesting mode is there's of course there's a normal slow mode, which is 0.89 megahertz. And that's the mode where everything works fine. The DRAM is refreshed and the video works fine. And that's sort of the normal mode for CoCo 1 and 2. In between, there's a address dependent mode, and basically the SAM figures out what addresses you're accessing. And if you are accessing, if you're accessing RAM, or there's actually one of the I/O blocks that also counts as a slow access area. In either of those cases, he'll be sure to clock at the slow rate so that you continue to refresh RAM and your video continues to work. And in the if you access ROM or in the other I/O ranges, those are all okay in that they don't interfere with the DRAM refresh or the video display generator's access to DRAM. So in those cases, he'll continue to clock the CPU at the faster rate. So that's pretty convenient, for example, if you want to run code out of a ROM pack, which is actually what I do with Farfall. So you can get a little extra speed. Others in the past have often recommended using that when running basic programs, since the basic interpreter runs in ROM. You spend a lot of time running code that's actually part of the basic interpreter when you're running programs that are written in BASIC, so it can provide a significant speed up. So anyway, I'm not really sure why they didn't just make address dependent mode just the default. I was looking for some specific drawbacks to doing that. I haven't found them. Maybe it's just because it makes cycle counting a little bit trickier. But anyway, I don't really see any harm in turning on the address dependent mode. So if you're ever writing your own code, you may want to go ahead and do that, particularly if you're going to run if you're going to run a program from ROM, like a program pack. Okay, well that covers the clock control. Okay, so next up would be the arbitration between the CPU and the video display generator. So this is called in the datasheet it's called IDMA, or interleaved direct memory access. What is maybe unusual, or at least notable about the clocking of the 6809 is that you have a two-phase clock. You have what's called an E and a Q clock, and they're somewhat out of phase. And so you between the two, you get essentially four phases out of where E is high and Q is high, and then one's low and then the other's high, and vice versa. Anyway, so it turns out that the CPUs will conduct memory accesses on a different section of these phases than what the VDG will do when it's accessing memory. And so because of this sort of interlock, you're able to guarantee that the memory accesses don't actually interfere with one another, assuming, of course, that the DRAM can be clocked at sufficient speed to satisfy the request. And so that is part of what the SAM is responsible for, making sure the clocks are distributed properly. And of course, he conducts his memory refresh also in the same sort of manner, so that the memory access, or the memory refresh, the DRAM refresh, is transparent to the CPU. Okay, so that covers most of the main jobs, and I'm going to take a short break and come back to discuss the display memory fetching and the role that the SAM plays there.
It's a Radio Shack Merry Christmas.
This year, I needed to give a real family pleaser.
Honey, please help me with this budget.
How about a new game, Dad? Please.
And I found it. Radio Shack's Color Computer 2. On sale for just $99.95. It entertains, educates, manages. It's expandable and affordable. Now that really pleases me.
The Color Computer 2. Sale priced for Christmas. Only at Radio Shack.
All right, well, now we've covered most of the features of the SAM, or 6883. Now I think we're going to cover something that's maybe a little less understood and maybe more interesting, and that's what is the role that the SAM plays in fetching memory for the video display generator, which could also be asking the question of why does the SAM need to know what mode the video display generator is in? So it turns out that in the application, basically probably any application that uses the SAM and the 6847, the address pins on the video display generator are not actually connected, or at least most of them aren't. One of them, I think just one, connects into the SAM as sort of a control signal. But the video display generator does not actually physically access memory. So what happens is the SAM actually is responsible for pulling data out of memory and making it available for the video display generator. So it does this well with a couple of bits of information. We previously configured a base address for video access with those little bit accesses to the special range of addresses provided by the SAM. So he knows where to start accessing memory, and he can keep track of the state of the VDG through a couple of external pins there. And so basically, the only other bits you're missing is what mode is the VDG in, which basically indicates what is the pattern of addresses that the VDG would expect to see. So, for example, normally you'd expect him to access, say in a text mode, you'd expect him to access 32 bytes of addresses, and then so that'll read the first line's worth of data, and then each text line is actually 12 lines high, so he'll access those same 32 bytes of memory. He'll access them 12 times before he moves on to the next 32 bytes of memory, and he'll do that for a total of 16 of those character rows, and then you're doing it 12 times each for a total of 192 lines on the screen. But that's the SAM that's now generating those addresses, not the VDG. And so that lets you put, by telling the SAM a different display offset, you can put your display memory basically, well, it would be effectively anywhere in memory, except the SAM only understands 512 byte offsets. So you can move them to any 512 byte block within your total address range. So that's kind of neat. And it works both with text modes and graphic modes, of course. And so, so that's a neat feature, right? It's so for example, the MC10, which also uses the 6847 VDG but does not have the 6883 SAM, that has a fixed graphics buffer because there's no way to move it. So there's a nice little bonus that the CoCo has by having the SAM. So it turns out the VDG mode information you're giving to the SAM doesn't really care about what happens on the screen. All he really cares about is the sequence of memory addresses that need to be read to get the data that the VDG wants. Right? So the VDG information that the mode information you tell the SAM doesn't actually map one-to-one with every mode that the VDG could possibly have. It actually is what you're describing is the sequence of address, is that the address sequence that needs to be generated for the VDG to generate the data it wants to see on the screen. Right? So, and as I sort of alluded to in the text example, the video output always puts out the same number of physical lines on a TV screen, or it's 192 lines. So if you put the VDG into one mode and then lie to the SAM about what the mode is, the SAM will go off and access the memory and feed data to the VDG based on what it thinks the mode is. The VDG will happily display the graphics data based on what the SAM feeds it for that particular line, and it doesn't know whether or not it should have been the same as the previous line or the next line. It just does what it's told. So because of this little discrepancy, In particular, you can use the semi-graphics 4 mode of the VDG, which would normally divide a text block, which is 12 lines high, would normally convert it or display it as a total of 4 blocks, two vertical by 2 horizontal blocks. So either way, he's going to display the 2 horizontal blocks in those areas or those lines of data. But if you tell the SAM that he needs to access a different pattern of addresses, then instead of getting the same 16 bytes 12 times, as I described earlier in the text example, you can get a different set of bytes every line or every 2 lines or every 4 lines, I think is the way it works. Anyway, you can get a different set of data within what the VDG thinks is the same block. And so this lets you, from the VDG's semi-graphics 4 mode, you actually can get what is called semi-graphics 8, semi-graphics 12, or semi-graphics 24, which are expanded semi-graphics modes that they're all 64 blocks wide, but they can be 192 or 96 or 48. I forget. I'd have to look it up. Anyway, you can get more blocks available on the screen. So it's an interesting trick. It's what I use in Farfall. Farfall uses the SG12 mode. It's a very colorful mode and can produce what I think are very good looking graphics from the Tandy Color computer. So I hope that is relatively clear how that works. If not, feel free to send us some feedback. Anyway, I think that pretty much covers the way the SAM works. Did mention earlier that there is a later variant known as the SN74LS785. It works basically the same. I think programming-wise, I think it is exactly the same. The exception is, and maybe there's probably a programming corollary to this, but the exception is that the 785 version can handle some different DRAM chips, which do some of their address multiplexing a little bit differently, and so it's got settings to accommodate those. And you will see the 785 variant of the DRAM paired with the 6847 T1 in some of the later CoCo 2Bs, and that's where you see them. So anyway, other than that, I think they're pretty much the same. I don't know for sure if you could pop one out of one system and pop it into another. Probably not, because of the DRAM size differences. But other than that, they're pretty much the same, and certainly do the same kind of job. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this description of how the SAM works and what job it does, and I hope it's been clear. Again, feel free to send feedback, and otherwise, I will now return you to the rest of the CoCo Crew podcast. Thanks.
Get ready, player. 1. Please select your monitor type.
Welcome to another edition of The Games Corner. In this episode, I will be reviewing a game from one of my favorite software publishers called DICOM Products. And no, it's not my favorite because they were Canadian, although that is a bonus. Hey, come to think of it, the CoCo got a lot of love in Canada. Anyone familiar with the CoCo will know DICOM has made some of the best top-quality games for the CoCo platform. Some of these games are original and others are excellent clones of arcade games. The game from DICOM Products I'm going to mention today is called Grand Prix Challenge. It is for the CoCo 3 and requires 128K of RAM, the stock amount of memory the CoCo 3 came with. So now you have no excuse not to try this game out. It was written by Dave Dyes in 1987. Grand Prix Challenge is a clone of the arcade game Super Sprint 2 from Atari. and it's also very similar to the game Super Off-Road featured on the Nintendo and other platforms from that era. Grand Prix Challenge features a top-down static screen view, featuring a whopping 25 tracks in total. In each track, you must complete 5 laps. You compete against several computer players at once, and you're all competing in the same race at the same time. If you collect enough wrenches while racing, you can buy additional upgrades for your car at the end of each race, including extra traction, speed, acceleration, and more. The extra cool feature of this game is that it supports multiplayer. It makes for a great games night if you have a couple buddies over. If you are interested, you can download this game from the Color Computer Archive's website at colorcomputerarchive.com. Well, my chewing gum is running out of flavor inside the studio here. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Games Corner. Until next month, keep those high scores rolling, and happy CoCo gaming. Well, it's that time again. We have reached the end of episode 3. Think we've ran a little over again this month. Hard not to with all these great projects and happenings going on in the CoCo community. We hope you enjoyed this show. Please keep your feedback coming in. I would like to thank my host John Linville for providing the 6883 text segment. Yet again, another top-notch segment for the community and newcomers to the CoCo platform. I know one thing, I've learned more about the CoCo in the past 3 months than I have in years. We are very lucky to have John making these for us. It's also excellent to have them in digital audio format. Makes it great for archiving. I would also like to give a big shout out to Cyber Ears for sponsoring our show. We really appreciate it. We also would like to thank all of you for listening. You are the most important part of the show. If we didn't have you tuning in, there'd be no point in making this podcast. Stay tuned for next month's show, and until then, happy CoCoing.